Next up on the broadcast, Katherine Robertson with the Alabama Policy Institute is back on the program with us this evening. Katherine, nice to see you again.
Nice to see you, Don.
Welcome back to Capitol Journal.
Thank you. Always a pleasure to be here.
Katherine, you spend a lot of time down here this time of year. You're, I will remind folks, a conservative think tank based in Birmingham, and I'm sure it's been interesting observing the effect of the controversy surrounding Governor Robert Bentley on the legislature. Now, we heard some characterizations early on about how it was roiling lawmakers, so to speak, but business proceeds, and lawmakers seem to be a little divided over this issue.
Yeah, I'd say that's probably a good description. I think that there are sort of one camp that thinks we've got to do something about the situation with the governor. We need to address it somehow. We can't just sort of sweep it under the rug and move on. And then sort of the other mentality is, hey, we need to continue on with our business. We only have, a couple of legislative days left in this session. We need to just proceed and get things done and just sort of let that, not be as big of a distraction as it could be.
The articles of impeachment, of course, were introduced in the House, and House Rules Chairman Mac McCutcheon has spoken out quite a bit about this issue. He said something this week that was interesting. He said, we don't necessarily have to settle this in the 8 legislative days remaining in the session. We could, if we chose, call a special session to deal with this issue.
That's right. I read those comments as well. This is such uncharted territory. No one's ever been impeached here before. And, people laugh about how long and detailed the Alabama Constitution is, but the provision on impeachment is not really that long. It's 2 or 3 paragraphs for something that could be a very, controversial, a very contentious process. There's not a rule book for it, as many of the legislators have sort of discovered as they explore this process. So to think that it could or should be done quickly or with expedience, I think would probably be a mistake, given that there's just so many unknowns about the process.
Given that there's not a rule book on this, as you put it, there's been a very careful effort to vet the process. They wanted to set up this commission that would take a close look at all of the charges outlined against the governor in the articles of impeachment. And at the same time, they said, we just want to have a process, period. The governor's controversy aside, we need to have a process in place should we ever need it.
That's right, and I agree with that. I mean, I would hope that we won't find ourselves in this position often to even be discussing impeachment. We would hope that wouldn't come up. But certainly, it's not a bad thing to know what the process would look like and to have it well vetted should you ever need to use it, because if there was some sort of urgent situation, and maybe some people think that there is right now, we don't know what to do, they don't know what to do, and they've got their regular business to take care of and are trying to sort of navigate this. So I do think it's worth exploring, just to know for future reference, if nothing else.
There's also a bill this year, I'm sure you're aware of, that would create a recall election process in the state. Now, it's getting a lot of attention given what's going on with the governor. We recently had the House sponsor on the program, Representative Will Ainsworth, who said if we had a recall election process in place, these impeachment articles of impeachment wouldn't even be necessary.
Yeah, that's right. Impeachment and recall are really two totally different tools. Both really come down to accountability, but one is a legislative process that really resembles a trial and is very specific, and as they're discovering, is very complex. A recall election in the states that have that option is really just a movement by the public to say, we're not happy with you for one reason or another. Sometimes those reasons are defined in the law, sometimes they're not, and it's just a merely up or down vote. So it's more of a, whereas impeachment is a legal process, this is more just a public opinion vote in a lot of ways. You mentioned Representative Ainsworth does have a bill that would do that, and again, his bill is not to recall Governor Bentley. His bill is actually to say Alabamians have the right to do recall elections for any constitutional officer or legislator. Interestingly, Alabama has recall a provision in place at the local level. Mayors and commissioners can currently be recalled with a 30% vote, or with 30% of voters in the last election signing the petition, and then with the majority voting to recall. So it's not completely a new concept. More than half the states in the union have some form of recall. So again, might not be a bad thing to have on the books, even if it's not particularly relevant to this situation. It just depends on what the legislature thinks.
The argument surrounding the Governor Bentley controversy has also seemed to fall along lines of, are we moving prematurely on this because the governor hasn't been indicted or charged with any criminal wrongdoing.
Right. Certainly there are, I guess, a lot of aspects to investigations, ethical and otherwise. I'm not sure that I would say it's a premature move to consider it, because as you and I have just discussed, it's going to take a long time for any of this to ever come to fruition. It's going to be thoroughly vetted in the meantime. So, if we were about to vote on an up and down recall vote, perhaps that would be premature. To consider legislation to have that provision in place, I think is perfectly fair.
The question has also arisen, can Governor Bentley function effectively as governor given the controversy surrounding him? He has said he has no plans to step down. He has continued forward with his agenda, his public schedule. The legislature is moving forward. Can he continue to be an effective governor given this, is the question on people's minds.
It's hard to say. I'm not really familiar with who he's surrounding himself with at this moment. I know that he has continued to try to push his agenda that was announced in his State of the State address a few months ago. You see the legislature moving forward on some of the things he's proposed, like his prison plans slowly moving. But I'm not really sure. I think there's the question of whether he thinks he can be effective. There's the question of whether the legislature thinks he can be effective, and then there's just the question of, is it just too big of a distraction for the state that it's just not in the best interest to have this hanging over us? And I think depending on who you ask, you get a lot of different answers to that question. The legislative session will wrap up here in a few weeks, and I think maybe only when we look back will we know whether or not he was able to be effective during this session.
Speaking of his agenda, Governor Bentley's agenda, you alluded to the prison plan, which he has been pushing aggressively in public despite the distractions surrounding him with this controversy. It's a bold move, building 4 new state prisons, super prisons, so to speak. 3 of those would replace a total of 13 other men's prisons, and we'd have a 4th prison as a new women's facility. And up to $800 million bond issue would finance this endeavor. What are your impressions of the governor's plan?
Well, bold. $800 million on anything right now is pretty bold given our state's fiscal situation, as you know. I served on the prison reform task force, and our goal was to really try to identify policy changes that would help reduce overcrowding. And those changes only passed last year, and some are yet to have even been implemented yet. So in some ways, I do wish we could see how those have an effect on our prison overcrowding, which is a very real issue and should not be downplayed. We're at almost 200% capacity, and there are changes that need to be made, and that was what we tried to address last year as a task force. Now, the spending is a totally different argument, and I guess our perspective is, as a think tank, we want to thoroughly analyze and vet any plan that spends any significant amount of money, but especially an $800 million plan. And as of right now, we don't feel like we have all the information that we need to really be able to do a thorough analysis, which is what we really try to do for a living. So I've talked to some legislators that sort of feel the same way, that they've been given some information, but there's just a lot of details that go into a complex plan like this. And I'm just not sure that it's not moving a little too fast for everybody to really know all of the implications. For instance, we don't know which prisons are going to be closed. We don't know exactly how these cost estimates were arrived at. There are just a lot of questions on a bill this size, and it seemed to be moving really quickly. We will see this afternoon what happens in the House. It's up in committee.
Yes, but given those concerns, do you think that it's enough to maybe really slow down this process or maybe stymie it altogether?
I would hope so. But we'll see. I was pretty surprised at the large margin that this bill passed by in the Senate. You heard some frustrations from people like Senator Paul Sanford, Senator Clay Schofield, and a handful of others that just said, we feel like this is moving too fast. We're not sure we're against it. We're just not sure that we're for it. We just don't feel like we have the information that we need to make an educated decision. And I tend to agree with them.
Governor Bentley, of course, vetoed the general fund budget this year, and the legislature overrode his veto. The big debate there continues to be funding for Medicaid.
Right.
Medicaid, of course, asked for a $100 million increase. It got $15 million in an increase under the legislature's passed budget. It's already outlined what cuts would look like that they say will be necessary given the amount of money that it was appropriated. Some of those are being looked at as fairly serious cuts. For instance, the adult prescription drug program.
Right. Medicaid is, and you and I have discussed this before, Medicaid is sort of the looming storm over the general fund budget every year. Almost every year they request a pretty substantial increase, and oftentimes that brings in an additional surge of federal money with it. The way that federal grants are set up with Medicaid, basically the more we spend, the more they send us. So there is a tendency to sort of prioritize spending in that regard, and of course in addition to the services that Medicaid provides. I'm not really sure that anybody has the answer for Medicaid right now. Healthcare costs nationally are going up. We have, a substantial number of Alabamians that rely on that program, but then we only have so much money to spend. And what you're seeing over time is that Medicaid, it now consumes almost 40% of the general fund. So there's just sort of this question of, we know these services are important and we know that they, need this money, but what about all these other agencies? They're taking cuts year after year. Where do we draw the line? And I think that's something the legislature will continue to struggle with. And frankly, it is something that nationally state legislators are struggling with, because Medicaid costs are soaring, more people are enrolling, and the money's just not there.
The line seemed to have been drawn this year with the legislature apparently sending the message that we value the service, but we can only fund you to a certain point before we exclude other agencies from enjoying any sort of increase.
That's right. And of course, with Alabama's very unique bifurcated budget system, we're trying to figure out what to do with all the money we have on the education side and trying to figure out how to make ends meet on the general fund side. And it's a strange dynamic. That is not to suggest that people would rather spend money on, Medicaid than education. Certainly not. I think most people would probably say education's their top priority. But it is a strange dynamic that is very unique to our state.
So maybe we need to operate under this kind of scenario with Medicaid for a while, see how it goes, and at the same time look for other sources of revenue. I know a first-tier $85 million conditional appropriation for Medicaid was included in the general fund budget, so if the money is found, it would go to that purpose. That's
right. I don't think the legislature is not sympathetic to Medicaid's plight and how many people that they're trying to serve. But again, they've got to work with the money that they have, and the general fund's revenues have been so flat and so stagnant, as the education trust fund revenues tend to do well. So it's just a situation that really we're going to see year after year, be it over the RCOs or some other service that they'd like to provide.
The Senate was considering the education budget today. Now, as you mentioned, it's a completely different animal. There were a few changes from the House version. They wanted to include principals and assistant principals in the teachers' pay raise. There was more money for transportation. There was a conditional appropriation for a bonus for education and retirees.
That's right. So again, strange dynamic. You've got the Education Trust Fund that has money to give people raises, where the general fund's probably cutting employees every time they pass a budget. I think one of the interesting things that sort of developed over the past 48 hours is while we're negotiating teacher pay raises and now principal and other support pay raises, the teacher tenure and the teacher evaluation bill that Senator Marsh was pushing has essentially stalled. So it's an interesting thing to watch that, you sort of got this bargaining chip of a raise, and you try to kind of get some reforms in there to just address the problems that Alabama's public education system is facing, and you don't get the one, but you're giving out the other. So that was sort of a strange development of the past 2 days.
Senator Marsh's PREP Act, as he called it, was extremely controversial from the get-go. Among other things, it would tie teacher evaluations to student achievement. It would also, as you mentioned, change the teacher tenure law. He decided this week that he wouldn't push it any further. There just didn't seem to be the unanimity on this issue, I guess, that he was looking for.
That's right. That bill has been in the works for months. There have been a lot of groups that had an opportunity to review it, our group included, but certainly groups that come from a different end of the ideological spectrum than we do. So there's a lot of input. I think he ultimately felt like he had gotten to a place where everybody was pretty well in agreement. But it turns out that I think there was still some hesitation. I think what you hear from the education community is that they would rather not have the legislature meddle in the way that they're evaluated and meddle in, student growth and how to measure that. But by my reading of the more recent drafts of the bill, now certainly it changed a lot over time,
Sure.
but the more recent drafts really were very deferential to the department and did not really try to over prescribe what needed to happen, but just simply say we need a way to evaluate you, and we'd also like to make these changes to tenure. So I thought it might be something that more people would be on board with, and I was pretty surprised to see that that was not the case.
Well, in the last week, Senator Marsh did say he was working closely with the State Department of Education to address its concerns. He also announced that the Alabama Association of School Boards had dropped its opposition to the plan, that it was happy with some of the compromises that had been made.
Right. I think one of the lessons I've learned being here every day is that change doesn't come easy. There are groups, when they're impacted by reforms, sort of the immediate reaction is to be defensive, and I can understand that posture, certainly. But I can attest to Senator Marsh's, he really did make the effort to try to bring everybody to the table. But there's always next year, as they say.
It was interesting, too. There was an appropriation set aside in the education budget for implementation of the PrEP Act. I think it was about $12 million.
That's right.
And that gives them, since he's not going to push this any further, that's a little more wiggle room in the education budget.
There seems to be a little wiggle room here and there. I don't know what will happen with that money. Those things were certainly intended to run alongside each other, so I'm not sure. I know that parts of his act was setting aside funding to help schools that were underperforming when they showed improvement, to pay for opportunities for teachers to be mentored and some things like that, to really try to bring up the schools at the bottom, not to try to punish them in any way through this legislation. So, I assume that somehow that money, will still be intended for those purposes.
But final analysis on the education budget, was it a pretty healthy, robust plan as far as API was concerned?
It seems to be. I don't really know anyone who has any complaints about it. I think the only people complaining about that budget are probably the folks trying to balance the general fund. Again, everybody loves spending money on education. Certainly it should be a priority. It's just a little bit hard to reconcile one budget over the other and how you want to prioritize these things, because the problem is all Alabamians have a bit of a different perspective on what priorities should be. All legislators have a difficult time ranking priorities, and so when you only have a certain sum of money and everybody is sort of talking about the sense of urgency for their project or their agency, the choices are difficult. And they said from the beginning they were not going to ask taxpayers for more this year, so they're having to work with what they've got.
Katherine Robertson with the Alabama Policy Institute. Always a pleasure to have you on the show.
Thank you, Don.
Thanks
Likewise.
for being here, Katherine. And Capitol Journal. We'll be right back.